Welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and today I'll be returning to my roots as an Anglo-Saxon historian. In the previous episode, Ellen and I talked about medieval sanctity, heresy, and superstition. We focused on St. Francis of Assisi, the heresiarch Waldo, and the folk cult of a heroic dog. We promised you that we would do a follow-up episode about the Cathar heresy and how it led to the creation of the medieval Inquisition, and we will. But today, we'd like to talk about one of the more puzzling episodes in the history of England's Viking Wars. In the year 1002, King Æthelred issued an order that the Danes who lived among the English were to be killed. Historians from the late 11th century on have represented this as a slaughter of innocent men, women, and children.
Sounds like ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, it really does. And that's how it appears in popular history, including the first episode of the recent Netflix series Vikings, Valhalla.
Dead. My faithful guards.
Your Highness, we came as soon as we could.
I know it is St. Brice's day, and you have undoubtedly left feasts with family, so please join me.
You said it was urgent, sire. Is there a threat?
Yes. Over 100 years ago, in an effort to ensure lasting peace with your people, my predecessors established the Danelaw.
Yes, sire. We've been here so long, many of us no longer remember our own language.
Exactly. They probably feel they are Saxon.
Yes.
But that's the problem, you see. They're not. This is not their home. When the cockle grows amongst the barley, there is only one way to purify the field. Therefore, tonight, I order that all Vikings living on this island be exterminated.
That sounds like ethnic cleansing crossed with the Red Wedding.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that's what the show's creator and screenwriter, Jeb Stewart, was aiming for. Archaeologists and academic historians, however, have their doubts. So please join us in our exploration of the blackest mark on the reputation of one of England's unluckiest kings.
Okay, let's start with the sources.
We have two written primary sources for this event. One is the Annal for 1002 in the Peterborough and Worcester manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They're essentially the same. The other is a charter issued in the year 1004 by King Æthelred. The Annal for 1002 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle begins with King Æthelred purchasing a truce from a Viking army that had been ravaging England and concludes with King Æthelred's edict to kill all the Danes. Quote, "In this year, the king ordered to be slain on St. Brice's day all the Danes who were among the English people, because the king was informed that they would treacherously deprive him and then all his counselors of life, and afterwards possess the kingdom."
So this Æthelred is the king known as Æthelred the Unready, right?
Yeah, and that is really misleading, and it's really unfair.
Okay, could you explain that?
The byname that Æthelred got stuck with posthumously was not Unready, it was the Old English word Unrad. Æthelred Unrad is an Old English pun. The name Æthelred literally means Athel, noble, Rod, counsel. Unrad means foolish or bad counsel. So Æthelred Unrad would have meant something along the lines of noble counsel? You gotta be kidding me. A more polite translation, preferred by historians such as Anne Williams, is Æthelred the Ill-Counseled.
Okay, so how did that become Unready?
Well, the Old English word unrat survives today as unread, but its original meaning of poor advice has been lost. By the 18th century, when David Hume wrote his multi-volume best-selling History of England, Unready had replaced unrad. This was both because the two words sound alike, and because Unready fit the popular image of Æthelred as a sluggish and lazy king, to quote John Milton. Believe it or not, John Milton wrote a history of Britain. I think this is a mischaracterization of a king who tried just about everything against the Vikings. Nothing that he tried worked, but that doesn't mean that he was sluggish and lazy.
So St. Brice's day was something that he tried? And who was St. Brice?
Well, St. Brice is a really obscure 5th century Frankish bishop, the successor to St. Martin of Tours, and he's not really relevant except it was his feast day.
Okay. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is Æthelred ordering the killing of all the Danes in England. Is there any corroborating evidence that he did this, or that an order like this was actually carried out?
You know, there really is. There's a truly remarkable charter, as I mentioned before, issued by King Æthelred in the year 1004 to the clergy of the Minster Church of St. Frideswyde in Oxford, and this is evidence that this order was carried out, or at least it was carried out, in the borough of Oxford.
Saint who?
She was a Mercian princess and a contemporary of the Venerable Bede. She founded a nunnery in Oxford, and strangely enough, she's the patron saint today of the town and the University of Oxford.
Who knew? So how does this charter support the account in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle?
It confirms it. The canons of the Minster Church of St. Frideswyde petitioned King Æthelred to replace the title deeds for the church's land because the originals had gone up in flames when the citizens of Oxford set fire to the church in their eagerness to kill Danes.
Yikes!
Quote, "To all dwelling in this country it will be well known that since a decree was sent out by me with the counsel of my leading men and magnates, to the effect that all the Danes who had sprung up in this island, sprouting like cockle amongst the wheat, were to be destroyed by a most just extermination, and this decree was to be put into effect even as far as death. Those Danes who dwelt in the aforementioned town, striving to escape death, entered the sanctuary of Christ, having broken by force the doors and bolts, and resolved to make a refuge and defense for themselves therein against the people of the town and the suburbs. But when all the people in pursuit strove, forced by necessity to drive them out, and couldn't, they set fire to the planks and burnt, as it seems, this church with its ornaments and its books."
Wow. There's a lot to unpack in there. I mean, I know the phrase cockles among the wheat does come from Scripture.
Yeah, it's a parable in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 13, verses 24 to 43.
But setting fire to a church to force the Danes to come out and be killed seems kind of extreme. Wasn't that a violation of church sanctuary?
It was, and it was a really serious offense at the time. Two of Æthelred's predecessors, King Alfred and King Athelstan, had issued legislation against it, as would Æthelred himself later in his reign.
That's kind of ironic. But maybe if the Danes were pagan, maybe this church sanctuary didn't apply to them?
Maybe it would have, but I think the Danes of Oxford were probably Christian, or at least they were baptized. A generation earlier, Harold Bluetooth, the king who united all the Danes under his rule, and the father of Sweyn Forkbeard, had converted his people to Christianity. So that's not really an out. I think that the scribe who drafted the charter chose the biblical parable of the cockle among the wheat, both to justify Æthelred's order and to excuse the extreme manner in which it was carried out in Oxford. In the parable, the farmer instructs the reapers to gather the cockle, bind them into bundles, and burn them. So by likening the Danes to the invasive weed of the parable, the king was signaling his approval of what was an egregious violation of the peace of the church.
To burn down one of the town's churches, dedicated to the patron saint of the town, the English townspeople must have really hated the Danes.
Yeah, and it really does suggest that the victims were regarded as an alien people rather than neighbors and kinsmen.
Likening all the Danes to weeds and describing the order to kill them as a most just extermination does sound like ethnic cleansing.
That's nothing compared to how the Norman monk William of Jumièges described it in his Deeds of the Dukes of Normandy, which he wrote around the year 1070. Quote, Æthelred, king of the English, defiled a kingdom that had long flourished under the great glory of most powerful kings, with such a dreadful crime that in his own reign even the heathens judged it as detestable, a shocking deed. For in a single day he had murdered, in a sudden fury and without charging them with any crime, the Danes who lived peacefully and quite harmoniously throughout the kingdom, and who did not at all fear for their lives. He ordered women to be buried up to their waists and the nipples to be torn from their breasts by ferocious mastiffs set upon them. He also gave orders to crush little children against doorposts. When thus, on the appointed day, this outburst of violence, death, and murder accumulated beyond measure, some quick and active young men took hold of a ship and fled, speedily rowing down the Thames out into the open sea. They crossed the wide sea and finally reached the harbor they sought in Denmark, and there they reported the bloody fate of their people to King Sweyn. When the king had heard the news, he quickly ordered all who lived in his kingdom to take up their arms.
Okay, but where did this Norman monk get all these gory details?
I think they're probably all a product of his lurid and vivid imagination.
Okay,
so William of Jumièges' intent was to disparage King Æthelred and to compare him unfavorably with his contemporary Duke Richard of Normandy.
Who was not a nice person either.
No, but a pretty effective duke.
Okay.
I don't know whether William of Jumièges would have had access to a copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. If he did, he ignored its explanation for Æthelred's order. For William of Jumièges, there isn't a plot by the Danes to kill the king and seize England. Rather, Æthelred acts in an outburst of fury and violence. He massacres a peaceful and inoffensive people. So William of Jumièges links the massacre to King Sweyn Forkbeard's conquest of England.
11 years later? That ain't quickly.
Yeah, but Sweyn did raid England in the years 1003 to 1004.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. He didn't invade and conquer England until 1013. I think that William of Jumièges' account is spun out of whole cloth. But something dramatic must have happened on the Feast of St. Brice in 1002 for a Norman monk 7 decades later to see it as important enough to be the reason for the Danish conquest of England.
So, making King Sweyn Forkbeard's conquest of England an act of revenge does sound very Viking and very medieval.
The 12th century Anglo-Norman historian William of Malmesbury, who's really quite a good medieval historian, made it even more personal for Sweyn. His account of St. Brice's Day focuses on 3 particular victims. King Sweyn's sister Gunhild, whom he describes as a Christian woman of spotless reputation, her husband Pali, a Dane whom Æthelred had made Earl of Devonshire, and their child. When Sweyn learns of the murder of his sister and nephew, he invaded England to avenge her.
That would be a traditional motivation, although the time lag still bothers me.
That's not the only thing that bothers me about it. Even though William of Malmesbury is considered one of the very best historians of the Middle Ages, there are some things really wrong with this story. Now, a Dane named Pali is in fact in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for 1001. Æthelred, we are told, honored him with gifts and lands, but when a Viking fleet appeared off the coast of Devonshire, Pali broke his oath of loyalty and joined the raiders with as many ships as he could muster. No contemporary source, however, names Pali as Ealdorman or Earl of Devonshire, and William of Malmesbury is the only account that makes him a victim of the massacre.
So at least he existed. How about Gunhild?
Gunhild presents a larger problem. William of Malmesbury is the only source for her existence. And again, there's a chronological discrepancy here. As you noticed, Sweyn's return to raiding England may have been inspired in part by news of the St. Brice's Day massacre, but his actual conquest of England took place more than a decade later.
I seem to remember when we were talking about the Battle of Hattin that Saladin supposedly launched his invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem because Raymond of Chatillon had broken a truce by attacking a caravan and capturing his sister.
Okay, you mean Reynaud of Chatillon.
You're right, I'm sorry.
Yeah. The capture of Saladin's sister appears only in one source, the old French continuation of William of Tyre. It's not mentioned in any of the Arabic sources. I'm not sure whether she or Gunhild actually existed. Vengeance as a motive makes a much better story.
And a traditional motif.
Yeah.
Are there any other credible accounts?
Maybe. Henry of Huntingdon, a contemporary of William of Malmesbury, and he's writing about the year 1130, 1140, based his story on, at least part of his story, on an oral tradition. He wrote, quote, King Æthelred's pride increased and his faithlessness grew. In a treacherous plot, he ordered all the Danes who were living peacefully in England to be put to death on the same day, namely the Feast of St. Brice.
Okay, so far that sounds like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but with an anti-Æthelred slant.
It does. Henry of Huntingdon used the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as his main source for pre-conquest history and follows it pretty closely. It's significant that in describing the St. Brice's Day massacre, he chose to omit the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's explanation and justification for Æthelred's order. It is not the Danes who commit treachery by planning to kill the king and seize the kingdom. Instead, the decision arises from Æthelred's pride and his own treacherous nature.
Why?
Well, the Archdeacon Henry of Huntingdon and his contemporaries were writing moral history. All events are part of God's plan. The Danish conquest of England, like the Norman conquest that followed it 50 years later, was seen as a judgment of God upon the sinfulness of the English people and their leaders. Æthelred's moral deficiencies fit into that narrative.
You said that Henry of Huntingdon drew upon oral tradition.
Well, the oral tradition part of his account comes next. And this is it, quote, Concerning this crime, in my childhood, I heard very old men say that the king had sent secret letters to every city, according to which the English either maimed all the unsuspecting Danes on the same day and hour with their swords, or suddenly, at the same moment, captured them and destroyed them by fire. Henry was born in the early 1080s, so the old men from whom he heard this story must have heard it from their fathers, and whether it's accurate or not, it's how the event was remembered in the East Midlands.
Okay.
His comment about the Danes having been killed by fire may in fact be an allusion to what happened in Oxford.
Henry of Huntingdon wrote that King Æthelred sent secret letters to every city. Do you think this is plausible?
Yes, but with a major caveat. English royal government in the early 11th century was more highly developed than virtually anywhere else in Christendom. The tangible evidence of that is Æthelred's ability to tax his subjects to raise tribute money to purchase peace from the Danes. The military organization of the realm was also sophisticated.
But apparently not that effective.
Yes, but sophisticated.
Okay.
The kingdom was divided up into administrative units. The largest of them were the shires, and the shires themselves were divided into hundreds. There were shire courts, hundred courts, and borough courts, all presided over by royal officers, either ealdormen, bishops, or royal reeves. The king would devise policy in assemblies where he was advised by the great men of the realm, lay and clerical, that was called the witan. He could communicate that policy to local royal agents by a written instrument known as the writ, which bore his seal.
In law school, granted almost 50 years ago, we still went through a history of English jurisprudence that I thought of as name that writ. So it lasted a long, long time.
Yeah, the writ becomes, in fact, the main instrument for what's called English common law. So I think it's possible that Æthelred sent out messages to his ealdormen, bishops, and port reeves.
Okay, what was your major caveat?
I can't see King Æthelred's edict having been distributed to all the towns in England. There is no evidence at all of massacres of the Danelaw. There's not even evidence of tensions there between inhabitants of Danish and English ancestry. The Danelaw was a synthesis of Danish and English custom, language, and culture. The leading men of the 7 boroughs of the East Midlands had Scandinavian names in 1002, and they still had Scandinavian names at Æthelred's death in 1016. So absence of evidence is not a solid foundation on which to build an argument. I know that. But given the extent of Danish settlement in Northumbria, East Anglia, and the East Midlands, and the prominent political role played by men of Danish ancestry in the Danelaw and in Æthelred's reign, how would it even been possible to execute such an order?
At least in the Danelaw, but the charter isn't from the Danelaw.
And you're right. And the charter is I can't say that word.
Incontrovertible.
Thank you. Evidence that at least in some places, Æthelred's edict was acted on.
Okay, it seems to me that the crucial question is who were the cockles that needed to be justly exterminated in Oxford and potentially elsewhere? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and St. You're going to have to pronounce that one. Thank you. Charter both say that the targets were the Danes who lived among the English. And Henry of Huntingdon says the same thing. Did Dane mean just Danish men, or did it include women and children?
Well, if you go by Viking Valhalla, it included women and children and even one dog, but we're not going to go by that.
No, so, please.
The consensus among academic historians today is that the order to kill was directed only against men. And here, archaeology provides some possible clues.
Woohoo!
In the year 2008, archaeologists uncovered on the grounds of St. John's College, Oxford, a mass burial containing the skeletons of a minimum of 36 males. With the exception of two 12 to 14-year-old boys, these men ranged in age from 18 to around 45. The majority were in their 20s at the time of death. They had all died violent deaths. The skulls of 27 had been broken, and all of them had been repeatedly stabbed. Some had healed scars from earlier wounds, as might be expected of Viking raiders or mercenaries. Significantly, in light of the St. Frideswitte charter, about a third had charred bones.
Wow.
Radiocarbon and isotopic analyses have dated the bones to between 960 and 1025 and identified the men as being of Scandinavian origin. If these are the Danes who barricaded themselves in the church of St. Frideswitte, the St. Brice's Day massacre as played out in Oxford wasn't indiscriminate, but was targeted against males of military age, most likely mercenaries quartered in the town.
So there were no skeletons belonging to women or children?
None. Like I said,
there was a couple of teenage boys.
There were a couple of teenage boys. But in England, at the age of 12, you were law-worthy. You were an adult. So even if there was a 14-year-old or two 14-year-olds, they probably were considered adults.
Wow.
In 2009, a year after the St. John's College discovery, a second mass grave of Scandinavian males dating to around 1002 was discovered on Ridgeway Hill between Dorchester and Weymouth in Dorset. This grave pit contained the disarticulated bones of 54 men who had been violently killed. Chemical analysis and radiocarbon dating determined that they also were Scandinavian males of fighting age, killed probably sometime during the reign of Æthelred. That these were Vikings is all the more likely because of the carved striations on the teeth and a number of the skulls, which was a Viking fashion. Although the skeletons show evidence of earlier cut wounds, there is no skeletal evidence that they resisted at the time of their deaths. The most reasonable explanation is that these guys had been bound and executed. Given the location of the burial pit, the dead may have been Vikings captured during a raid, but it's equally possible that they were a company of mercenaries billeted in either Dorchester or Portland.
Can we be sure that either or both of these mass graves are victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre?
No, we can't be certain. No. Radiocarbon dating provides a range, but it doesn't provide something close enough to say that these graves are from the year 1002. But they could be. The dead could have been Viking crews captured and executed, as I said. But given that a third of the skeletons at St. John's College were charred, it's awfully tempting to associate them with the events recounted in that charter.
You said twice that they may have been mercenaries. Why?
because it would fit in with the historical context.
Okay.
English strategy seesawed back and forth between raising armies to fight Viking raiders, and when those armies were defeated, paying those raiders to go away. And once you pay them the Dane Guild, you never get rid of the Dane.
Yeah.
This
Kipling had a point.
Kipling did have a point. Despite his popular negative reputation, King Æthelred was actually active and creative in developing alternative ways to countering the Vikings. He ordered the refurbishment of the defenses of towns. He even had new towns constructed on the site of Iron Age hill forts, which would be more defensible. He divided England into ship districts that were responsible for contributing ships to the king's navy, and he even used the hide system of taxes so that every 8 hides would be responsible for producing 1 mail shirt for English soldiers who lacked that protection. And then, when all of that failed, in the year 1009, he ordered a nationwide program of prayer and penance to seek forgiveness from God.
So far, that sounds like his grandfather, Alfred, would have approved.
Actually, his great-great-grandfather. But you're right, Alfred would have approved of it. And the problem was not that these policies were bad. The problem was that they were used ineffectively. They were imposed ineffectively.
Okay.
Now, the thing about the prayer and penance, it didn't work at all. I mean, that was followed by the conquest.
I mean, thoughts and prayers only get you so far.
Yeah, but it just simply means that the English were really sinful and deserved it.
Okay. Anyway, back to our story.
Okay. Among the policies that Æthelred tried, and he tried this twice, were hiring Viking raiders as mercenaries. And this wasn't a new policy. 9th century Carolingian kings across the Channel had done the same thing.
And wound up with Normandy.
Yeah,
but
which was settled by Viking
raiders
who became mercenaries.
Okay.
2 characteristics of Viking raiding fleets made this possible. First, these were composite fleets made up of several or more individual companies under their own ship captains. They weren't bound together by ties of kinship, lordship, or even kingship. What unified them is a shared goal: the accumulation of as much wealth as possible. And Vikings were open to acquiring wealth by looting and pillaging or by being paid tribute money. They preferred the latter.
Okay.
It's safer, more lucrative, and it brought them provisions as well as silver. So Viking bands had no difficulty taking service with kings whose lands they were raiding, if they thought it better to eat at a king's table than to overturn it.
So did that happen shortly before 1002?
It happened. In the years 993 and 994, a Viking fleet of 94 ships ravaged England. It was a combined fleet. The 2 leaders of this was a Norwegian adventurer, Olaf Tryggvason, and the King of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard. Now, these 2 guys were rivals at home in Scandinavia, but they were allies as long as they were raiding England. They had a common purpose. Olaf had his eye on the throne of Norway. The problem is, Sweyn claimed Norway as a tributary state of Denmark. So Æthelred, having again been defeated in battle, bought peace by paying them 16,000 pounds of silver by weight. The Vikings didn't always trust that the coins were pure silver, and provided the Viking fleet with provisions to overwinter at Southampton. Æthelred followed that up by inviting Olaf Tryggvason to meet with him, and only Olaf, not Sweyn, to meet with him at his royal palace at Andover. And he contracted a separate peace with him. In return for the payment of an additional, and this is a large sum of money, 22,000 pounds of silver, Olaf pledged that he and his fleet would leave England, and they would only return to aid Æthelred against other Viking raiders. Æthelred then stood sponsor for Olaf at his Christian confirmation at the hands of a bishop. He gave him rich gifts and sent him back to Norway, accompanied by English missionaries.
Okay.
Sweyn thought it prudent also to return to Scandinavia. But not all of Olaf's captains and their crews went with him. Some stayed behind. Those who chose to stay entered into Æthelred's service. He gave their leaders, including the aforementioned Polly, estates and expensive gifts and received oaths of loyalty from them. We can't be sure how he dealt with the rank and file, but it's likely that he settled companies of mercenaries in the major boroughs. That's how Canute the Great would later maintain his Danish fleet when he ruled England.
And how did that work out?
Terribly. When a Viking raiding fleet ravaged England in the year 1001, Palle broke his oath, gathered as many ships as he could, and joined the Viking raiders.
So, if Æthelred could have, he probably would have had him killed.
Yeah, and Palle probably wasn't the only one. I suspect that the townsmen of Oxford resented having to pay for the food and lodging of Danish mercenaries who lived apart from the townspeople and who they couldn't trust to defend them.
Reminds me of the people of Boston resenting British soldiers being quartered in their town at their expense.
Yeah, but at least the British soldiers weren't pillaging them earlier.
That's true.
In 1002, there were undoubtedly townsmen of Danish ancestry in Oxford, but they had lived there for generations and were part of the community. Danish mercenaries remained outsiders.
Are you saying that the cockles in the wheat were the Danish mercenaries?
The honest answer is, I can't be sure. Nobody can. But if the skeletons excavated at St. John's College, Oxford, belonged to the Danes who took refuge in St. Frideswida's church, they weren't women and children. My guess is that they weren't even long-time residents. My money is on the victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre having been mercenaries whom King Æthelred had settled in Oxford and other towns. Given the lack of any contemporary evidence of massacres of Danish women and children, I doubt that St. Brice's Day massacre was an 11th century attempt at ethnic cleansing. It's more likely that it was King Æthelred's solution to his mercenary problem.
I've always said that the most painful wounds are self-inflicted.
Yeah. The St. Frideswida, and I wish it was an easier name to say, St. Frideswida Charter is also a morbid testament to the effectiveness of English royal government in the early 11th century. I can't think of anywhere else in Christendom in which a ruler could have ordered a massacre throughout his realm on a specific day and have it actually carried out, even if only in a few towns. Well, that's about it, and I don't think we quite solved the question, but then again, this is the early Middle Ages, and we just have to work with the evidence we have. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you'll be able to come back for our next episode.
When you can expect the Inquisition.
The medieval Inquisition, not the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish. Okay, we'll quit.
Okay. Bye for now.